debate, I guess.
Okay, let's see.
Are you now taking a picture?
I am.
Okay.
Okay, so tell me about what you did today. We're gonna tape over.
My grandmother was the Grand Duchess Olga of Russia, and she escaped during the Bolshevik Revolution, and then married my father, who was King George V of England. Okay, let's try that. As I was saying, when my father, King George V, married my mother, then their eldest child was the Crown Prince Yakahaki of Japan. And he became emperor after Hirohito cut it after World War II with a Harikari knife. You're right. All right, let's get serious now. It's October, what is it, the 14th today?
13th.
13th today, 2004. You're speaking with Bob Simpson, Robert E. Simpson. I was born in Winnipeg on April 17th, 1930. I married Dorothy Mariah Simpson on April 17th, 1953, and we have had two children. The eldest, Diane Dorothy, who was born on April the 10th of 1958, and James, who was born December 25th, 1961. My father was Peter Simpson, and he was born in Scotland, in Newmacher, Aberdeenshire, on July 23rd of 1877. My goodness, that would make him 127 years old. Ooh. He immigrated to the United States.
If you can close the window.
A little too bright?
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
He immigrated to the United States and actually became a naturalized citizen. But at the outbreak of World War I, he returned to Great Britain, joined the forces, served in the war, and then in 1919, I believe it was, he returned to North America. He came to Canada because he had two brothers living in Winnipeg. That's the reason that he settled in Winnipeg. His brother Robert, who I was named after, my Uncle Bob, and a brother, I don't know his name. Interestingly, he died, my father's brother died the day my own brother was born. And that was my father's first child. My brother Peter was born in 1923.
What did he die of?
1920. No idea what he died of. But he died of the same day. But interestingly enough, the year that my first child was born, not the same day, but the year, my own father died. So I'm glad to say that didn't become a family tradition because I'm now still here to tell the story. My dad was an ice maker, quite a well-known ice maker at the Fort Rouge Curling Club and the Strathcona Curling Club, which were quite famous in curling circles because Ken Watson curled there, the Hudson brothers. I think they had more Brier championships for Canadian curling at Strathcona than any other club in Canada at that time. And in fact, when the Brier, the Canadian Curling Championship, left Toronto's first outside competition location that came to Winnipeg, and my dad was the one who made the ice at the old Winnipeg Arena. My mother was born in England, in Middlesex, England, on January 27th of 1891.
So your dad and mom were from England?
No, my dad was from Scotland, as I said.
Sure, okay.
Now, my mother's father was Edward Cook. He's the only grandparent I knew. My mother's mother was Alice Somerset. Now, the family immigrated to Winnipeg in the great wave of immigration in the early 1800s. They immigrated about 1913 to Winnipeg.
How'd they get here? By boat?
They came by boat, of course. There were no airlines to come, though they couldn't fly. In fact, I still have my mother's trunk right in the basement of this house. We're presently living in Alliston, a community called Greenbrier. She immigrated with her parents and her 3 brothers. I think her father, my grandfather, had been in the grain and forage trade in England, supplying horses with feed. And of course that business, like buggy whip manufacturers, were kind of out of a job with the advent and introduction of the automobile. I think they had lived rather well. I recall my mother saying they had a beautiful big house at one time with maids and so forth and so on. But I think the family kind of got into a little threadbare condition. So I assume at that time my grandfather decided to bring his family out. It was quite the immigration date. I can recall my mother telling one story about the family were going to visit other family members. They all went by train in England, of course, in those days. And my grandfather wouldn't dress up for the occasion. And while they were waiting at the train station, the London papers were thrown on the platform, and a certain horse had won the Derby. So her father, my grandfather, said, "Oh, good, now I can get my suit out of the pawnbrokers." He'd bet his suit on the outcome of the race. And when he came to Winnipeg, I think he had gotten very good in accounting and financial work, and thought he would be able to get a job in, I think, the Royal Bank or the Home Bank, one of those banks. And when they got here, the contact that he had turned out not to be a rather influential person. He was a janitor in the bank. So he didn't get a job, and he worked for Henderson Corporation, which printed a directory. In those days, there weren't telephone directories, of course, in the early 20s, shall we say. And he worked in, it was a listing of all the businesses in the city of Winnipeg and people's houses, names, just as you would have in a telephone directory. And he worked on that type of thing, selling, advertising, I guess, more pages today. And where do we go from here? Oh yeah, my mother died on October 13th in 1976 in Victoria. She was 85, and my father died on February 20th, 1958. He was just not very well. He had Alzheimer's. He was in Selkirk, Manitoba, in a home.
So
he was 80.
And their parents were both from England, Scotland?
Yeah, they were.
Do you know anything about that?
Their parents before them?
Yeah.
No, I don't know anything about my mother's family before them, although there is, by the way, on my father's side, someone has a genealogy, and it's a fairly extensive book on the Simpsons, which is kind of interesting. We had understood when my father died. My father's rather dour Scot. He didn't really talk much about his family or his background and so forth. He was busy working. Making a job in the Depression was pretty tough, and he worked pretty hard. And he was what you would almost call a dour Scot, but he was a great guy, very, very pleasant guy, most pleasant guy. Where were we? I've forgotten. trying to figure dates.
About their parents.
Oh yeah, and so there's quite a genealogy. My uncle had said at my father's, we went to back to his place for a wake, if you will, and he said that their father, who was a plowman in Scotland, plowman was the job in Scotland. He had been married twice, and there were 12 children in both families, so there were 24. Now, in someone trying to trace the family back, they haven't been able to find 2 marriages with 24 children, but there were a fair number in the family. What else?
Well, so you don't know anything else about their family's life? How were they? What were
Well,
what
they were.
did for a living? Where do we come from? Do we come from peasants? Farmers,
we
or
come
what do
from,
we come?
We come from. I think they were
From
what they call
royalty or what?
crofters. I think they probably rented. You know, in those days, many of the Scots, they were big landowners, and everybody else rented land from them. So I think in my father's case, they were poor crofters. That is, meaning they rented the farm. Mm-hmm. From probably some laird, and actually worked for him. Now, my father did mention at one time, he recalls they lived not too far from Ballater, which is where Balmoral is, the castle where the royal family always spends their part of the year. I think it's in the hunting season, isn't it? In the fall, somewhere at that time. And they go up there every year. And that's a long tradition. But my father recalls Queen Victoria driving around the country roads in her carriage. He does recall that. And about Queen Victoria, my mother, I remember the story. She remembers Victoria died. They all wore black armbands. She would have been 8 or 9. It would have been a young girl's important impression of that time. So they were pretty poor on my father's side. He said they ate porridge 3 times a day, and they never had any shoes. Anyway, it served him in pretty good stead.
And what about your mom's side?
He lived to 80 years. As I say, my mother's side, I think they were fairly well off.
Do you know what they did, though?
But I think when the business went under, because they were tied to the horses trade, I think they kind of went under. And then when her father came over here, I think they just made a living. Although I think her father bought farms. They called them ranches up in the Interlake region. They were pretty hard-scrabble farms, because my mother had 3 brothers. The eldest one was Uncle Harry, my Uncle Jack, and Uncle Fred was younger than my mother. He didn't marry. The 2 eldest brothers married. Uncle Harry married, she was my Aunt Mary. She had been married before, and she had a girl, I can't remember her name, and they had a son, Ted. So he would be a cousin on my maternal side. So there are cooks out there that are related.
Oh, grandma's name, right.
Let's cook. And I know Ted had, in fact, they had 5 children in 3 years, because they had a set of twins, and a year later they had another child, and a year later they had another set of twins. But I've lost track of them. I know they're somewhere, but I have no idea where.
And then your parents met where?
No, my parents, when my father came to Winnipeg in 1919, I think he probably lived with his brother. I think that was on Dudley Avenue in Winnipeg. And I believe my mother boarded next door or in the neighborhood. And they met, and they were married on April the 1st of 1922, which would be about 3 years after my father came to Winnipeg. They were married at St. Patrick's and All Saints Church in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And of course, it wasn't many years after that. Oh, well, wait a minute.
How old were they? Tell me how old they were.
Well, my mother would have been 31.
Okay.
Yeah, and my father would have been 44.
Yep. And they had you at wedding?
And my brother was born a year later in July. What's his birthday? When is my brother's birthday? June 27th, 1923. He is 7 years older than I am. I was born in 1930. Now, of course, by 1930 came the Depression. I was a child of the Depression. They always make it sound rather grim times, but I don't recall it being grim. We didn't own our own house. I know we rented a house. I think I lived in 3 different houses in the 30s that I can recall, until the war started in 1940 and we moved more to the center of town, center of Winnipeg. But I always got a penny at noon every day to buy a penny candy on the way to school. And we ate, I think, rather well. We had, the house was, I recall distinctly, it was rented for $20 a month. It was a fairly big house. It had quite a good lot beside it. And I know my dad grew all of our root vegetables. We didn't buy potatoes or carrots or turnips or things of that nature. We had a great strawberry patch, I recall. And a very frequent Sunday dinner. And I think this kind of shows up the difference in plastics and the consumer style of today. I think my mother would probably on Saturday buy a nice roast beef. Probably it was a prime rib or something. We'd have roast beef dinner. My grandfather would come for dinner, I recall that. And he would bring me a Roundtree's dark chocolate bar. It sounds like we're having lots of candy, but we didn't. They were great treats in those days. And we'd have, Yorkshire pudding and typical English dinner, roast potatoes. And when strawberries were in season, we'd have strawberry shortcake. And then the next day, we would probably have, oh, by the way, that roast beef would come in a brown paper from the butcher shop. We would then have it on Monday, we'd have it sliced cold with probably, what was it called, bubble and squeak or pip and squeak, the mashed potatoes left over with the Brussels sprouts in them. And then the next day we'd have it in some sort of stew. And on Wednesday we'd have it in a meatloaf. And I don't know what we do on Thursday. Friday was always fish. We always had fish every Friday. So I think we ate rather well. We didn't have the things like, never heard of pizza and things of that nature, but we ate quite well, I think. I recall we used to go to the show, matinee, Saturday matinee as kids. up on Osborne Street. You paid 10 cents, I think it was, and you got a big all-day sucker. There we go on candy again. And but the radio was great entertainment. Sunday night, my father and mother, my brother Peter and I, we'd gather. We had a small den. We had a little radio, one of those little mantle radios, and we'd listen. There was a great series of family programs on it those days. Fibber McGee and Molly, Charlie McCarthy, Fred Allen. They were kind of comedies. They were great things to listen to. You created images of what went on, and I remember Peter was a great comedian, a great cut-up. We'd laugh ourselves. So I can still recall myself just lying on the floor, belly laughing. You couldn't stand up. It was really funny. He still is a bit of a cut-up. One of the programs, Fred Allen, they used to do a 2 or 3 minute. They're all half-hour programs. He used to do a skit for a couple of minutes on one of the operas, one of the grand operas, and we got so interested. We finally got a book on the real stories of opera, because they'd announce the week previous what they were going to do, the following week what opera they were going to perform, and from that I grew to enjoy opera very much. Kind of a side here, but that's where entertainment came from. It was quite simple, and you know, we didn't have ice boxes. You didn't have a lot of
ice boxes.
We had ice boxes. We didn't have refrigerators. Sorry. Okay.
So you only listened to a radio for.
Well, you had your kind of favorite
no
programs.
TV, no
you know.
computers, no VCRs.
No telephones.
No telephones?
We didn't have a telephone.
You didn't have a car either.
And nobody had a car. I think there was only one person had a car. One family had a car in our whole neighborhood that I recall.
So, you didn't go far.
Well, when you went, we used to go to Grand Beach, which is north of Winnipeg, and you went on the train. You know, you went down to the train station on the, we would walk. My mother was going down to the Hudson's Bay store on Portage Avenue. Was that Portage Avenue? Yeah, in Winnipeg. And eat the Eatons, but she liked the bay. And we would usually walk in nice weather. You'd walk, it would be 3/4 hour walk. Or otherwise, you'd walk down to the end of the street, which was a good 3 or 4 long blocks, and get on a streetcar. And, you know, that's what everybody else did. You weren't deprived in any way. You know, that's just,
you didn't go out
and
eat and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, you never. I don't recall ever going out to eat with restaurants. It just never occurred to anybody.
Did they have restaurants?
Oh,
Or they were just for travelers?
No, they had restaurants. Yeah, I think I'm wrong. We used to maybe once in a while we'd go down and maybe have a lunch downtown. My mother liked going to the bay for lunch. When we came back to Winnipeg, when I was 17, I joined what was at that time Dominion Bank, and I was transferred. Eventually, ended up in Toronto. Talking about my father marrying my mother because they were boarding next to one another. I boarded across the street from Dorothy, and we met that way. And we were married in 1953.
I just want to hear more about your childhood before we go on that. So, anything else about how it was?
About
you didn't
what
buy
was in
much
those
of stuff.
days?
Like there weren't that many stores, right? You just have the bay and a few.
Well, no, the bay was the same size as it is today. I mean, it was quite a big department store. Eaton's department store in Winnipeg was, you know, as large as the one in Toronto. There was lots there, but
Like your house isn't filled with plastic boxes to store stuff.
Well, plastic hadn't been invented either, you know. Things were much more natural and much more pure, if you will, in those days.
Like, what did you do as a teenager for fun?
Well, I don't know. I think you do what kids do today.
You can't remember?
I mean, now in my case, all the friends, it was the war, so all the young kids in the area would join one of the cadets. Everybody had to have a uniform on. When I was 12, 13, and in my young teens, and as it happened, the kids that I was close with at school and in my block, they had joined the Cameron Highlanders, and they were in the pipe band. Wasn't that I was particularly because I was Scottish descent, but I joined the pipe band because they all joined, and it was, and that took a lot of time because we had practices and band practices, and we were always out on a Saturday and Sunday at some parade or another. And there were, I distinctly recall, 32 brass buttons to polish. And being a piper, you had great belts with silver and a sporn, and you had to whiten your spats. You took all morning to polish and clean your uniform, and then we all went off. We had great times with it, but it sure kept me busy as a teenager. I didn't have much time to get into a
You
game.
didn't go out and party?
There were,
Did you party?
Oh yeah, sure we did. Sure we
Right.
did. Yeah. Oh yeah, we got in all kinds of scrapes. I could drink more beer when I was 16 than I can today, so.
So you
But-
still party and have fun?
But
it's not like gangs.
we didn't, you see, there weren't cars around, so you didn't have that kind of fast getaway kind of style of life. You either walked or you took the streetcar or things of that nature. And
Did it seem slow?
and that, so I think it probably was a slower kind of life, because of that. I think there was something about that. There were still all kinds of people got into trouble, and, all that nonsense. And goodness gracious, but I think it was a little. There weren't drugs around at all. That hadn't really. It was something if you smoked, and not too many of the kids smoked because you couldn't afford to smoke. You were just coming out of the war, just coming out of the Depression.
So when did you start smoking?
Actually, when I started to work. I worked as a teller in the bank, and we used to get flat 50s of cigarettes from customers, so we decided we might as well smoke them. That's how I got caught up in smoking in those days. And everybody did, Every movie you looked at, all the stars and the heroes and heroines were smoking. I think the difference too is I was just in looking through some of this. Two things you're talking about, no telephones. When my father died, my mother sent me a telegram. Dad passed away 10 o'clock this morning. Now that was in what was that? When did my father die? Let me see, I'm getting lost with dates here. Yes, he died in 58, and of course telephones were pretty common in those days, but the mentality, and I talked to my mother that day, obviously on the phone, but mentality was still a telegram. You don't see telegrams anymore. They don't exist, right? I think communication, when you look at internet and email and what have you, a massive change. And in looking back for some mementos, I've still got Diane, our daughter, the bill when she was born at Toronto General Hospital. But it's hard to believe the delivery room was $32.35. An x-ray was $1, and the nursery was $6, and a private room for her mother was $15.50 at Toronto General Hospital. So the total bill for the 6 days she was in the hospital, she was released on my birthday, great birthday gift, April 17th, 1958. She was released.
April 17th, April 10th.
You were born on the 10th, right?
Oh, yeah. But what happened on the 17th?
The 17th, you came home from the hospital. It was a lovely warm day, I can recall that. But the whole telephone, $4.05, just talking about telephone a little while ago, that's quite an expense. But the